Welcome everyone, and thanks for joining us. We have Robin Mellon here from Supply Chain Sustainability School, and we're up on the 34th floor, so I'm feeling very high. Look, we're here today to talk about a very important conversation, which is about social supply chain and modern slavery, what's happening globally, what's happening in Australia, and what you need to know about it and what we can do about it first and foremost. So first of all, I want to warmly welcome Robin.
Thank you. Great to be here.
Who really has a lot of expertise in this area and has been enjoying significant contribution and information and education around social and supply chains. Robin, do you want to tell us a little bit about the school and you in that role, but also what the school is focused on?
Sure. So the Supply Chain Sustainability School has been around for about 3.5 years in Australia. We are funded by and supported by the leaders in the industry to provide free sustainability learning resources to all of the small, the medium, the large organizations in property, construction, infrastructure, supply chains. So we're funded by leaders like Len Beast, Lang O'Rourke, John Holland, Kundal, people like that, as well as a lot of supported by many of the not-for-profit organizations, including Green Building Council, Infrastructure Sustainability Council, Supply Nation, Social Traders, people like that. To provide, when I say sustainability education, I don't mean necessarily face-to-face classes, although we do run events. I mean making available webinars, e-learning resources, templates, documents, videos, all sorts of things that anybody can use to familiarize themselves with the changing topics that make up sustainability. Now, you mentioned social sustainability at the beginning, and there's been this rapid arc, this rapid change over the last decade from the focus on environmental, energy, water and waste, environmental issues, through economic. We've seen resilience, risk management, economic value, gain focus, to social sustainability. And there's a lot of attention on social sustainability at the moment, quite rightly so, which is around everything from health and well-being of people on construction sites or actually working on projects, to people in buildings, the building occupants. And of course, that goes into social value. How do you calculate social value? How do you equate it? Social enterprises, human rights and modern slavery, which you mentioned, and all of the impacts across the supply chain. Now, all of these things really go to make up sustainable procurement. So, you know, the new ISO 2400, the new international standard for sustainable procurement, is touching on all of these elements to make sure that not just are we being energy efficient, but are we being resilient? Do we have resilient communities? Do we have resilient businesses? But also to look at the people within our supply chains and to draw some much needed focus on them and to try and balance all of these issues out.
So really, big business can play quite a role in this space, isn't it? I mean, sustainable procurement that you mentioned has quite a large realm of potential impact. Do you see business in Australia taking this seriously?
There's a lot of businesses taking it seriously, and it's funny, procurement, you know, I can have this conversation with, you know, year 6 students or with boards of directors. Procurement in a way is, you know, is strategic purchasing. We go out and buy stuff. It's purchasing. There's procurement. Well, how many of these things are we going to need over the course of a year? Can we get them more cheaply? And then there's sustainable procurement. So not only, you know, price, but considering all of the impacts, environmental, economic, social, all of the impacts from what we are purchasing, what we're procuring. The power of our procurement is huge, and we shouldn't forget this either as individual consumers. You know, where I buy my coffee from, they may seem like tiny steps, but they really add up. Because if I choose to buy my coffee from a fair trade certified coffee supplier, and I choose to talk to my friends about this and harangue them or nag them or tease them about their choices, that procurement power builds up. And so big businesses in Australia, the moment they start to choose to procure more sensibly, more sustainably, more socially, actually have massive economic, social environmental economic benefit that can be brought. So if you're Lend-Lease, if you're Nestle, if you're any large organization, the power of saying, this is how we choose to procure. These are the standards, these are the values that are dear to us, that are important to us, and this is how we will make our decisions in future. That power is huge.
And how do you think the ISO 2400, which you mentioned, is helping that in a real way?
Well, the ISO 2400, the Sustainable Procurement Standard, it's not a certification standard, so you can't measure yourself against it, so to speak, although you can have people vouch that you are following those steps. It's a guidance standard. So it's there to provide a framework to allow organizations to procure more sustainably. And in providing that framework, it's not just a piece of paper, a template, you should do it like this and not like that. It's looking at how you engage your staff. It's looking at how you engage your suppliers. It's looking at how you have those conversations. It's not just about, right now at point of purchase or at point of tender, we need you to meet these specifications. It's about how do you build relationships that you can change together. All of the markets that we can think of are in some sort of state of flux. And the more that we build relationships with our suppliers about content of materials, about where they've come from, about the people along the way, the more opportunity we have to make those better.
And in terms of social, where do you see the risks here? I mean, what is business looking at and saying, oh, these are the areas of biggest risk to us?
So most supply chains have 5 key areas of risk, and most of the organizations that I can think of are probably working with 2 or 3 of those quite well, and 1 or 2 of those not terribly well. So there will be many of them that are looking at strategic risk. Where are we going? We have a strategic plan. This is where we want to be in 3 years or 5 years or even 10 years' time. Some of them are looking at regulatory risk and how, if the regulations change about content of products, about health and safety, about all of these things, how will we stand? I think a lot of people are underestimating things like reputational risk, the damage that can be done to your brand, the damage that can be done to people within your organization or within your supply chains by having things which are either non-conforming or non-compliant or simply bad business practice. This is not just damaging to you economically, as in you take a short hit. This can kill your brand. The power of social media to encourage transparency, visibility is huge. And so whilst there are a lot of risks there, and I'm sorry to be all Pollyanna, there's a lot of opportunities there for businesses to say, this is a risk, this is something that we're not doing well, but the opportunity there is to do a lot better, to take people with us along the way, to discover what we need to be doing, and actually to have a much more resilient business.
I'm glad you bring up about opportunity, because I'm with you. I think I see a lot of people who, there's areas of their supply chain, they don't really know what's in there and they're a bit scared to talk about it. And I think leadership is actually the opportunity to say, we don't really know everything yet, but we've got these steps in place to do something about it. So how do you think, where do you see people making that commitment? So number one, how are people prioritizing in terms of those level of risks? And where do you see people grabbing those opportunities in leadership and saying, yes, actually, we don't have all the answers, but we are going to walk our talk?
That's kind of 2 questions, because where am I seeing and where would I like to see are probably 2 different things. I think understandably, and I can talk to my behaviors or organizational behaviors, I think people are putting oil on the squeakiest gate first. So the things which are most visible or the most identified as posing the biggest risks are probably getting attention first and foremost. That may be a good thing, but it may also blind us to some of the things that are happening anyway. I'll use a vaguely bizarre example because it's uppermost in my mind at the moment. There is a lot of attention being given to specific parts of the supply chain at the moment, despite the fact that we're losing species globally in terms of biodiversity faster than ever before. 60% of species have undergone some massive change since 1970. These figures are getting worse, not better. So whilst I can understand why that, squeaky gets the oil is a good thing. I think we need to maintain that, strategic view across our supply chains. One of the things that I would say, you mentioned leadership, and I think that's true, but I think partnership is the new leadership. I think the thought that we can do all of this ourselves, we can change our supply chain is rubbish. I think if we adopt a collaborative, a partnership approach with the organizations, the tier 1, the tier 2, with the organizations in our supply chain, then we have a chance to change things, to improve things, to look at the opportunities. I'll give you an example. If you're going out to tender on, doesn't matter whether you're talking about 50 chairs or 50,000 tons of concrete or whatever it is, if you're going out to tender, if you wait until that tender point and then you go, right, who's got what that meets these specifications, it's too late. You're not too late. You're going to be very limited in what you can choose. The time to start having those conversations is as soon as possible, because if you can say in 1 month's time, or in ideally 1 year's time, I'm going to need these 50,000 tons, these 50 chairs, 1 year's time, and I want you to meet these specifications, you are sending a very clear signal, either about social or economic or environmental issues, a clear signal that you're going to be looking, of course, at price, but you're going to be looking at these other benchmarks. That's actually partnership, because you're prepared to work with people to send clear signals to say, these are the changes we need to see. And that may be around human rights.
So let's talk about human rights, because I think, I'm seeing a lot of people talking about modern slavery and looking at legislation. We've got legislation passed in New South Wales, and we're still waiting to see what's happening nationally. But what people think about what modern slavery might look like and what it can encompass, to me, are quite different things. Can you talk to me a little bit about, what you see that it might encompass and human rights in the broader sense of how it might sit in modern slavery legislation?
Yeah. That's a really broad question. I don't know how many hours we've got for this webinar, but we can give it a go for a while. I think human rights issues are so worrying because they are so unseen. We, myself, my family, my peers, the industry, we tend to live in our little fur-lined ruts, and we are very comfortable there, and actually it gives us a bit of discomfort to consider the people that are working in our supply chains in products or services or materials. And I think once we start looking and discovering these things, this is where it all gets a little bit uncomfortable. So around human rights or modern slavery, for example, there are different classifications that we could put around different conditions. We have all worked in bad jobs in the time. Maybe you haven't. I know I have worked in bad jobs in my career history. We worked in badly paid jobs. Many of us have worked in unpaid jobs, in internships, in volunteer roles. And there's a very clear distinction between unpaid or underpaid or unpleasant. I think those are conditions where essentially people are free to leave. If they are unhappy, if something is wrong, if they are feeling uncomfortable, they can choose to leave. Conditions of modern slavery arise when people cannot voluntarily leave. And that may be because of fear of what might happen to them, because of fear of what might happen to their families, their loved ones, to other people. That can also happen when people have had communication or documentation or money taken away. So I'll let you leave when you've paid your debt back. I'll let you leave when I have got your visa through. I'll let you leave once you have worked off your family's debt. These are conditions where people are given false hope, but are essentially do not have the ability to leave. And modern slavery unpacks into multiple different situations. So human trafficking, sex trafficking, indentured labor, bonded labor, child labor. There are lots of different circumstances, but coming back to it, it's where people do not have the ability to leave, cannot voluntarily leave.
So that could almost go to that sort of economic level too, in terms of feeling trapped as well. I'm interested in your comment about unpleasant workplaces too, because there might be some things here that aren't captured by the legislation, but also it's still not the moral right thing to do in that sense too. So how do we expand that? what do you think this means for Australian businesses? Because, does it touch us? Is it happening here in Australia? Is it only one particular sector or one particular business?
So many thoughts in answer to that. So a very high level comment is that I think there are a lot of supply chains in our society, across Australia, across the world, that exist because of modern slavery, that rely on modern slavery to keep them going. I think we need to be aware of that. I think it's unrealistic to expect to buy a $1 t-shirt and not wonder where that came from, who was involved in that. And I'm not picking on apparel or clothing in particular. I think there are food products, there are FMC, fast-moving consumer goods, there are building products that we need to look at and go, how is that possible? So one, I think we rely on that. And I think where something is incredibly cheap, it's too good to be true, it probably is. There is probably somebody who is not getting paid for that. What was the question here?
Well, I think that's really interesting about, if it's cheap and too good to be true, it probably is. And I think there's something around making sure, I know with our pledges we've talked about not offshoring risks and saying, well, it's okay here in Australia, but maybe we've sent the problem offshore to someone else. So I think that's important too. But does this really happen in Australia? Is it really happening, or is it only in the food industry perhaps in Australia, or is this really an overseas problem?
It's not just an overseas problem. I think the prevalence of modern slavery in Australia is quite a lot lower than in many other countries, maybe than across the Asia Pacific. I think there are certain high-risk industries in Australia, construction, retail, beauty sector, cleaning, for example, that we need to start looking at, because typically where you have roles which are considered low-skilled roles, often which may be filled by migrant workers or people who are in the country temporarily, are looking for visas, are here for a short while. There are different factors which can contribute to people being in, I won't say unpleasant, but unfortunate circumstances where they may not have the ability to leave. There was a report published yesterday or in the last week about migrant workers and wage theft. And it was reporting the extraordinarily high incidence of people who came to Australia on a temporary basis and left feeling that they actually had the wages withheld. And this was not just one or two people. This was an extraordinarily high percentage of people who just were not paid but did not feel able to say, wait, I was promised this, I was told I would get that, and didn't. So I think there are certainly in different industries, as I said, and there are examples that we can look at where people have been working in terrible conditions because they have ended up there. 7-Eleven workers, I know, were in the press, domestic workers or domestic cleaners in embassies around Australia, certainly Sydney Airport, baggage handlers hit the press over the last few years. There have been different instances. And although the prevalence of modern slavery in Australia may be considered low, estimated between 4,000 and 15,000, depending on which reports, which figures you look at, people across Australia, we're kidding ourselves if we think it's sort of not really our issue, because the majority of our goods, our services, our materials come from overseas. And that's where the prevalence is significantly higher. If it's estimated there's 40.3 million people in conditions of modern slavery worldwide, over 30 million of those are from the Asia Pacific, where a lot of our goods, our services, our materials come from. And if we start looking into that, we can look at a country-by-country analysis from the Global Slavery Index. We can look at the breakdown. 71% of those people are female. We can see the enormous disparity between one country and another, and what we're actually buying and how we should be using our procurement.
So how do we work with that in our supply chains? Because I know sometimes that feels like that's beyond our control. So if we're looking at our suppliers, and we do have a lot over the Asia Pacific, for instance, what would you suggest people do? What are the conversations they start to have?
So there's kind of internal and external conversation. There's conversations that you have maybe within your family or within your own business, your company, your with your peers. What behavior do we accept? What do we know about? Where do these things come from? And that may be, sorry to go back to the coffee example, but where does our coffee and tea come from? Can we choose better? Obviously, price will be a consideration. Are there better choices that we can make? And I think that is one of the core questions that I'm really glad it comes up from Year 6 students or universities or boards. When people understand what modern slavery is, what it means, when they understand the prevalence, one of the next questions is usually, so how do we make better choices? So I think internally you can have those conversations, and the more the issues around human rights and modern slavery are normalized, people understand what this means. They understand that actually this is not a rarity. This is a frequent occurrence. And we need to look not just at food and beverage or clothing or building materials, we need to look at a lot of supply chains and work out the standards, the benchmarks, the values that we're willing to accept there. And I think that's where you need to start looking organizationally at how do we procure? What are the things that we would embed in our procurement policies, internal, external, but also our vendor codes of conduct? These things are not acceptable, these things are acceptable. And ideally, I would love to see larger organizations and then medium and then small organizations having sustainable procurement policies that aren't just looking at energy, water, waste issues, but are looking at working with their suppliers, collaborating with their suppliers, educating their suppliers over a long period of time. This is not an overnight change, but also looking at the social impacts within their supply chain from, excuse me, from things like paying their suppliers on time, which of course has a big knock-on effect, in that first tier, to the human rights issues, the human rights values that you are talking about, insisting upon through your supply chains.
And so, to be clear, we're also not saying about, well, this country is a high-risk country, so let's cut them out. And that's what I loved about what you said about the new leadership is partnership. So to reinforce what you said about working with your suppliers, yes, there might be some high-risk countries of a particular product within a particular country or even a particular region, but we're not about removing them, are we? Because could we actually cause a bigger problem by suddenly changing our supply?
So we can look at, International Labour Organization or Global Slavery Index figures, and you can see where prevalence of slavery is higher, either by, number of people in conditions of modern slavery in that country, or by, percentage. Possibly the worst thing you could do is look at that and go, well, we're not going to procure from India anymore. If you are Kate and you are working somewhere in somebody's supply chain in a quarry in India producing stone or granite products, if suddenly that supply chain is removed, that procurement of this quantity of stone is removed, where does that leave you? Does that mean that you are suddenly no more in slavery? Or does that mean that you could be transferred to another supply chain or another product, or actually, because there is less demand for your product, you're going to be paid less than you were in the first place? And placing people in a nexus of harm by removing that procurement is one of the worst things you can do. Sending clear signals, as I mentioned earlier, about 1 year on, this is where we want to be. Working with your suppliers, setting up a partnership to say, it's now 2018, by 2020, we want to be able to say that the materials that we are procuring from this supply chain or this company or this country are certified, are free of slavery, or at least that we can be sure about where things come from. Because at the moment, what concerns me most is not what we know, it's what we don't know. And that's much more worrying, because I talk with builders, with tradespeople, with different sized companies, and often if you say, where did this come from? I don't know, I've never been asked that. It's not that they don't care, it's that they don't know and they've never been asked. It will take years to have those conversations and see these changes and see partnerships built up and knowledge, information management passed through supply chains. It will take years. But the time to start is right now. And the time to start is when we have examples of what this looks like when it's done well.
I agree. It's really great advice around how we start working together. And so in terms of what you see with modern slavery coming to Australian shores, how can people start to prepare? So there might be a 2-year time frame, but what can we start to do now to get ready?
I think what you know is really important. What you don't know can kill your business. It's a statement, and that doesn't matter whether you make furniture, whether you're an importer, whether you're a builder, whether you're an interior designer. It doesn't matter. What you don't know could kill your business. I think what we need to start doing is taking careful steps about what we know. We know where these things come from. We know about these supply chains. We know who we're dealing with. To start asking questions and asking open questions, not a closed question. Kate, do you have slavery in your supply chain? Oh, panic. Don't push people into things, but start asking, can you tell me where this comes from? Can you tell me if these countries are involved? Can you tell me anything about the people you're working with? Not, can you break your commercial and confidence factors? Tell me how much you bought it for and from where, because that's where people lock up. But to say, this is where we're trying to go with this is what we're trying to do. And to start, now, you can use different terms, risk mapping, hotspotting, but to start looking at where are maybe some of your areas of risk. Your risk areas may be around countries. They may be around particular products. They may be around areas where you have big black holes of information, where actually you've got no idea where something came from, and actually every time you ask, people clam up. That would worry me much more than somebody going, oh, it comes from this country, and I think it comes from there, but I don't know, we can find out. So I'd start asking these questions. I'd start collating the information. I would not worry about feeling overwhelmed, because that is a common thing. That is a common feeling. If you are David Jones, you have thousands, tens of thousands of suppliers. If you're Coles, if you're any large organization, you have tens of thousands of suppliers, and this is an overwhelming concept, but you've still got to start somewhere. If you are a multi-year major infrastructure project, again, thousands of suppliers to consider, but again, better that you start somewhere. And so looking at where are our risks, why don't we start with a couple of examples? Why don't we look at some case studies of where companies have looked through a particular product line or a particular part of their supply chain and what they found and how they have then used that knowledge to apply it to other things. So to look at what Nestle have done with cocoa, to look at what Fairtrade have done with coffee, to look at particular examples and go, what can we learn from this? Not necessarily what can we replicate immediately, but if we look at one supply chain, we may find not just the risks, but some amazing opportunities. Well, if we've been getting it from there and it's been going through 17 different points to get to us, that sounds really expensive. Could we get that from a different place? Could we get it from different people? Could we get that from within Australia? What are the alternatives? And I think to send a very clear message and perhaps a long-term and a medium-term message that these are the values that we find important. And we want to work towards more sustainable procurement, towards respecting human rights and modern slavery, to paying a living wage through a supply chain. These are important statements that if you say frequently enough, that people in your supply chain will understand and will partner with you to move towards.
So in summary, it's bigger than the obvious what we might think of as what slavery used to look like. It can be more hidden. It's certainly on Australian shores as well, is what we're hearing, and it touches every sector. And I'm also hearing about not freaking out, actually just being open and start to explore and work together. And in terms of getting ready then for reporting, that's not as scary as it sounds either, is it? I mean,
no. Yeah. So there's still a lot of discussion about what will organizations, won't organizations have to do. Essentially making a statement means stepping your way through 4 parts of this is my organization, this is where our risks are, this is what we're doing about modern slavery, and this is how well those are working, those measures are working. These are the processes and our successes or failures around that. I think there are two ways of looking at this. The firstly around modern slavery is to say, well, we will wait until we are forced to do something, until we have to do something legally. And that is a perfectly acceptable solution. I would encourage you to go beyond that, any organization to go beyond that, around three different areas. The first is awareness. Find out what you know and what you don't know. Raise awareness of modern slavery, raise awareness of the issues, have the conversation and normalize the term. I still get asked, what is modern slavery? And so I think that's a perfectly rational, logical conversation. Slavery, the word slavery still conjures up pictures of people in shackles, being moved around in boats. And I think the term, the word modern is there because often the shackles can't be seen anymore. They may be around documents or visas or money or force or fear, but they are the shackles that we can't see. So helping people understand the term. The second is around engagement. Well, what are my suppliers doing? How can I ask them? How can I find out what are you doing about this? What do you know about where things came from? How are you asking? How are you finding? How are you proving? And I think that last part, awareness, engagement, and support, is how do we support our supply chains to do better? And I think, going back to what I said earlier, sending a strong signal that we want to keep procuring with you. We really do, but we need to know these things. We need to be sure of these things to manage our risks and to manage yours as well.
And I know from our experience at GECA, we have a lot of licensees trying to get information from lots of different countries around the world, and it takes quite a lot of time to get that information, particularly for a smaller market like Australia. So it isn't going to happen overnight. And the other thing we've seen at GECA is where we've found a problem, or the auditors on site have actually found a problem. How do we actually deal with that? Excuse me. How do we actually deal with that and manage that really carefully?
Yeah. I think there's still a lot of uncertainty around what do we do. You and I can chat about, what do better choices look like, and of course, better choices look like GECA certified products or GECA certified materials. And I think that is, I won't say an easy, but that is an obvious solution. I think what do I do if it is found is a very hard question. I have a lot of respect for Andrew Forrest, from Fortitude Metals Group, and who's led, Andrew and Grace have led the work through the Walk Free Foundation and the Global Slavery Index. But Andrew Forrest, being a billionaire, can stand up and say, I found modern slavery in my supply chain, and we said that things should change, and people didn't move away. And I'm often tempted to say that's because you have billions of dollars, and people want to work for you. And similarly, people want to work for a Coles or a Lendlease or a large organization, so they're not going to lose business. I think it's much harder for a small or a medium-sized organization to put their hand up and say, we've found modern slavery in our supply chain, because the fear is people will leave. People will walk out of the door and their order book is suddenly empty. So I think we need to normalize the conversation. We need to expect this. This is not going to be a if I find slavery. This is going to be a when, because it's so firmly embedded in global supply chains across multiple sectors and industries that there's an expectation. Global profit from modern slavery last year was estimated to be $150 billion US. So this is a high profit industry for the people who are keeping people in conditions of modern slavery. But I think being clear about this is what I've found, being open, being transparent, this is what I found and this is how we are rectifying it, and we have immediately removed all procurement from that supply chain, but we have given the opportunity to the people to change this. We have given them 3 months, 6 months, 1 year to demonstrate how they have changed, how they have improved, what they have done to move away from this, and to document it, because it's not enough to say, oh, we've taken all the slaves away, okay, it's all better. You need to say, or they need to say, this is what we have done to rectify the situation, to verify that that's the case. And I think the last part of that, and this will become more evident over the next 6 to 12 months as the federal and New South Wales legislation sort of emerges and becomes clear, is what do I do? Who do I ring? Because right now, if I'm working on a major project and I believe there is slavery on a site, people in bad conditions, or somewhere in the supply chain, I don't know who to call. There are obviously organizations like the Freedom Partnership or Anti-Slavery Australia who are doing amazing work in this space, working with the victims of modern slavery. But if I call the Australian Federal Police, do people risk getting deported? What, are people going to be in a position of more harm? What do I do? Now, I am relieved that the situation in the UK, they introduced a Modern Slavery Act in 2015, and now it is commonplace to see posters, leaflets, examples on pinboards, in tea rooms, in canteens, talking about how to spot the signs of modern slavery in multiple languages, put up by local police force or different industry associations, and that it's frequent. So the resources are there. There are hotlines, there are phone numbers, so that people are encouraged to do this. And so if you're on a building site late at night and you see people being herded into the back of a van, you need to do something. Not saying something makes you complicit in that situation. And so being able to ring a number and say, I've seen something which concerns me. These are the details. This is where it's happened. And I'm not going to stereotype, but that may be on building sites or with cleaning companies or nail bars or retail situations where you can say, this concerns me. I do not feel right with that. And the more we can work with our supply chains, the more that we can normalize the conversation, the more that we can give people an option what to do, the more we will see this change.
Thanks, Robin. It sounds like it's up to all of us, actually.
Absolutely.
We all have to be responsible for this and look out for it and know what to do, whether that's us as an individual or an organisation. So
I think the school has a really valuable role to play in educating people what this means, why it's relevant, what to do, what do I do differently, and to lead people into more information when they need to ask that. But I think GECA similarly has a really valuable role to play in this is what better choices look like. This is what verification, this is what certainty, this is what transparency and visibility look like. Because the more transparent your supply chains are, the easier your information management, the more you're managing your risks, and the more you're looking at all of those opportunities. And I think it is going to take years. This is not an overnight success. It's going to take years of working with our supply chains, but the benefits to the people through our supply chains, the benefits to the people with whom we procure, the benefits to those partnerships that I mentioned are enormous.
So tell us about the website and what tools you have. So I know you've got some fantastic tools for people to use. So how can people find them? And specifically in terms of, social and supply chain and modern slavery, where should they go?
So the supply chain school we've got 450 resources, I think, as of yesterday. Different resources. It's a lot. We are scratching the surface, trust me. There's a lot of different resources, as I said, from videos, e-learning modules, templates, documents, all sorts of things. And honest statement, please, if you see something good and it's not there, just email me through a link. I'd really appreciate them. There's a lot of good resources out there which don't get enough views, don't get seen enough, so aim to promote those. We cluster our resources around 10 key themes, 10 key topics, which go, of course, through environmental, economic, social. We have a separate landing page for modern slavery, which is where you can find, obviously, videos. You can find the modern slavery report that the school wrote about modern slavery in Australian property construction infrastructure supply chains early this year. We will be releasing over the next couple of weeks a modern slavery e-learning module, which will be viewable on your phone, on your tablet, on your desktop, which sets out the situation in a very clear, easy to understand, relevant way. We have taken every acronym out of that module. And there's a lot in it. And there's a lot. Isn't there, Robin? And so tried to make it really easy to, for every procurement manager or contracts manager or project manager or builder or tradesperson or designer to get a handle on what this looks like. So as I said, there's a separate landing page which you can find easily enough if you go to the website, and there's more being developed every month.
That's great. So it sounds like there's lots of tools. We just need to go to your website, have a look, and we'll let you know also when the e-learning kit gets launched.
And the one thing I would say, I don't know how to say this as a positive, so I'll give it as a semi-negative. From experience, Australia's property construction infrastructure sector is rotten at looking at other sectors for examples. I think there's a lot going on in other industries that we can learn from. It is very easy to think, oh, well, I can't learn from them because they're very different. And the answer is yes, they probably are very different in a lot of ways, but we risk blinding ourselves to instances where people have solved problems already. They've got great examples. They've actually streamlined their supply chains and created extraordinary efficiencies. And if we refuse to look outside our sector, we lose that opportunity. So I think looking at other sectors, looking at medical supplies, looking at food, looking at all sorts of different areas, we stand to gain a lot.
Do you have a case study on the top of your head that you would encourage people to look at?
Around modern slavery, I think there's a lot going on. I think, I mentioned Nestle and cocoa, I mentioned fair trade and coffee. I think we can look at a lot of different examples. We can look at medical supply chains. Obviously, supply chains which have hit the papers for negative reasons in the last 10 years, have done a lot to try and clean up. Now that may be because they were put on the back foot and they need to regain shareholder or market trust, but often it has resulted in something good. It has resulted in them being forced to look at things differently. So that's why I would encourage people to look at different sectors. There is a lot of good examples out there.
That's great. Thanks a lot, Robin. You are doing so much in this space and we see you talking everywhere, and I think you have a really powerful story to tell. And I think the importance of partnership and the opportunities for Australian business and us as individuals is really an important one to tell, and you tell it so beautifully, and I think you also tell it with someone who cares, well, I know cares about this space, which actually is kind of what it's about too, isn't it? It's not just reporting and making sure that we tick all the boxes. This is a really a big human problem we're trying to solve together for all of us. So I encourage you all to look at Supply Chain Sustainability School too. Go to their website, have a look. Feel free to email us questions. We'll also let you know when the e-tool comes out, but there is lots of great information available. And as you said, the time to start is now. So a big thank you for coming and talking to us all today. Really appreciate it. Let's see if we've got any time for questions. I don't know, we don't have a lot, but we don't have any questions either. Okay, so big thanks to you all for joining. It's been really useful, and I look forward to seeing how Australia progresses and also when the legislation gets announced.
Yeah,
it shouldn't be long at all, so watch this space. Thanks everyone for joining. Thanks, Robin.